You have entered an alliance of practicality, chiefly based upon the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But as your common enemy slowly grows weaker and weaker, you know that the alliance cannot last beyond its original purpose, defeating Hitler and the Nazi Reich. Therefore, as your troops march upon Germany, its industrial hubs and scientific research facilities, you try to get a leg up on your allies.
After all, above all, of one thing you are certain. Your ideology and that of the West make a future clash very likely. Therefore, any advantage you can gain by plundering the Nazi Reich, its scientific and technological marvels, and recruiting its scientists could prove decisive sooner rather than later.
Of course, we're talking about Operation Osoaviachim, the Soviet Paperclip. Hello, darlings, and welcome back to another episode of Spice and Ties, and I'm Astrid Deinhard.
And I'm Anna Deinhard. Recently, we released our Paperclip special outlining US efforts to recruit Nazi scientists and utilize Nazi technology. So, we also must cover the Soviet efforts to capitalize on the scientific and technological remnants of the Nazi Empire. As in the American case, these efforts are not born right at the end of the war, but had their origins sometime before.
In this case, the date of birth, if you will, is September 1944, just as the Soviet army is preparing to enter Germany proper. At that time, under the authority of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the NKVD, a special task force is created. From 1934 to 1946, the NKVD is the Soviet Ministry of the Interior, but really is more like a secret police than a traditional ministry. It is no coincidence that the NKVD is also often portrayed as a predecessor of the KGB, right? Mm-hmm. At the KGB.
In any case, this task force aim is not any old German scientists, but specifically German nuclear scientists, who are supposed to aid in the Soviet nuclear bomb program. From September 44 until April 1945, the task force mainly gathers data on the German nuclear program and the scientists who are a part of it. But then, as the Soviet armies capture Berlin and the war draws to a close, it is finally time to take action.
How do they get their hands on the scientists? Well, by making false promises. Especially the Soviet representatives approached the scientists to discuss potential short-term contracts within the Soviet Union. Most German nuclear scientists did not mind making a business trip to eke out a living. Whether the Germans did not realize the inherent danger or did not mind facing them, the Soviet authorities never had problems recruiting technical personnel. Unfortunately, scientists are very much like prostitutes, remarked one of German scientists who would end up working for the Soviets.
Soon, however, the scientists catch on to the true Soviet intentions. In the case of Manfred von Aden, head of the Forschungslaboratorium für Elektronenphysik in Berlin-Lichterfelde, it is the remarks of the Soviet interpreter upon his landing in Moscow. Haven't you brought your children with you?
In Berlin, everyone working at the Institute already knows the Soviets' true intentions by then. Just 10 minutes after Ardennes left for the airport, more than 100 Soviet soldiers come to the Institute and round up everything. More than 750 boxes are packed, and just 22 days later, the rest of the staff from Ardennes Berlin Institute meets him at a spa near Moscow.
He will stay in the Soviet Union until 1955 as head of the Physical Mathematical Institute, also called Institute A. A.
In, where is it?
In Sukhumi.
There you go, at the Black Sea.
So much for short-term contract. But while technically a prisoner, he is also handsomely rewarded with money and even receives a medal, the Stalin Prize, second class. Overall, the German scientists come to the Soviet Union not entirely voluntary, but without physical pressure.
That was good. Beside Ardennes, roughly 100 German nuclear experts are brought to Russia in the first operation. These include other renowned experts such as Gustav Hertz, Nikolaus Riel, and Peter Adolf Thiessen. Here we have two notable differences between the Soviets and the American approaches, at least at the very beginning of their efforts to secure German scientists. Initially, the Americans want to merely exploit German scientists for roughly 3 years, and they are not to be properly integrated into American society.
Again, it is important to stress that this is only at the beginning of these efforts. The Soviets, on the other hand, seem to be interested in long-term exploitations from the start. They are also willing to overlook someone's past to keep the scientists happy and content. But for the moment, these nuclear brains are the only ones taken away in an official capacity, that is.
There are also many other scientists and researchers who are taken in an unofficial capacity. In other words, they are captured and abducted without the charade and pleasantries reserved for the nuclear brains. One such example is the great-grandfather of this episode's writer, Sebastian, and he's sitting over there. Hello, Sebastian.
Hello. Hermann Eugen Brandstätter worked as a researcher in the Thringswerke AG in Hirschberg, Schlesien. This offshoot of the big Thrings conglomeration had been tasked with the creation of a parachute silk substitute for the German war effort.
In February 1945, Hermann Brandstätter was captured by Polish forces and later handed over to the Soviets. In the Soviet Union, he is interrogated about the processes and fabrication techniques he worked on during the war, after which he remained in one of the infamous Soviet prison camps. Eventually, he escapes in 1948, arriving back home in June on his third escape attempt, alone, traveling thousands of kilometers, mostly by foot. His is just one of the countless such stories, and while they may be interesting, they're not the focus of this episode. So, let's get back to the official Soviet efforts. In the days following the unconditional Nazi surrender, in the chaos and turmoil, one thing matters greatly, at least in terms of capturing scientists. What areas of Germany do you have access to, and which research institutes and laboratories are located there?
The Americans are lucky in the sense that they have access to Peenemünde and Mittelwerk, both crucial sites with regards to the V2, the Nazi terror rocket. As we outlined in our Paperclip episode, you should really check it out.
You should really do that.
Really do it. They eventually hand these over to the Soviets.
They also have access to Thüringen and parts of Saxony before giving it to the Soviets. The region that became the Soviet occupation zone was already highly industrialized before World War II. For strategic reasons, the National Socialists began to expand the industrial sector in central Germany in 1936 already, to increase arms production and to prepare for war.
This means that the Americans have first-hand access to the most advanced research laboratories in the Reich, as well as the brains behind them, specifically the frontier of German aeronautics, the Me-163 rocket plane. For instance, large parts of the V1 and V2 related institutes, guided missile research, and so forth.
However, the Americans know that they soon have these areas over the Soviets. Thus, they quickly get to evacuate as much material, research notes, and scientists as possible. As a result, roughly 2,000 scientists and their families, together with countless parts and blueprints, are evacuated before the Soviets take control of their occupation zone. According to an American assessment,
the removals meant that the Soviets acquired not completed V2s, few, if any, components for the V2's control system, and probably few technical drawings for the missile. But they nevertheless came by intact production facilities for the V1 and V2, a stock of complete V1s, V1 components, and lots of important components for the V2.
Yes, yet this assessment soon proves to be over-optimistic. The Soviets found enough V2 parts to assemble many missiles and came by parts of the control system. Even more factors, at least initially, play into American and British hands. The advancing Red Army has, as most of you know, not the best reputation among Germans. Thus, in the weeks and days leading up to the end of the war, there are many scientists among the masses frantically fleeing before the advancing Red Army.
On the other hand, one advantage of the Soviets is that there is simply so much material that the Americans cannot take everything of importance. They also do not have time to find everything. For instance, 10,000 tons of taboon, the Nazi nerve agent which lies hidden in the future Soviet occupation zone.
Another is represented by the fact that in the weeks immediately after the war ended, the Soviets have unlimited access into Berlin. Because being the capital and all, Berlin also harbors important institutions and scientists, as is the case with the German nuclear scientists, of course.
Now, with their occupation zone secured, the Soviets begin their efforts in earnest. Yet, there is one more problem plaguing the Soviets. They simply do not have the technical expertise or the equipment to take everything back to Mother Russia and get to work. As one Soviet scientist laments upon seeing the V2 factories at Nordhausen.
Not one of our institutes, factories, or laboratories could even imagine such abundance. This is why the Soviet State Defense Committee decides to take a different approach. Why overcomplicate things? Some of the facilities around Berlin and elsewhere in the Soviet occupation zone are still intact. Some of the scientists are still there. Why not just continue to work there? From the second half of 1945 through 46, multiple cooperative organizations emerge.
One of them, the Laboratory Construction Bureau, soon becomes the main joint scientific and technical complex in radio engineering and electronics. By August 1945, the Bureau is already a sight to behold. Its facilities span 18,000 square meters with over 2,000 employees, including more than 600 engineers. The Bureau is headed from the German side by a Doctor of Mathematics and Physics, Karl Johann Steimel, and from the Soviet side by Georgy Wildgrube. The products made here are soon brought to the USSR as part of the reparation plan.
Another similar institute is set up near Nordhausen in Bleicherode, Thüringen, close to the underground Mittelwerk factory which produced the V2. Just 4 days after taking control of the region, on June the 5th, 1945, Soviet rockets and aeronautic experts arrived. among them Boris Chertok and Alexander Isayev.
Seeing the scope of the work ahead of them, they immediately founded the RABE Institute, which stands for Raketenbau und Entwicklung, Rocket Construction and Development. Without authorization or coordination from the Soviet government, Chertok immediately made himself the head of the institute, moved into Werner von Braun's former villa, and started employing the remaining scientists from the local area.
What a deal. While the Americans are taking away the cream of the crop, some, for one reason or another, are open to work for the Soviets. Like Helmut Grötrup, that's his name, right? Grötrup, who served as von Braun's deputy for guidance, control and telemetry at Peenemünde during the war. Contrary to his former bosses and colleagues, he does not want to go and relocate to the United States, desiring some sort of stability for himself and his family. Although located in the American zone, his wife Irmgard secretly passes his offer to the Soviets. I will work for you, but only under the conditions of complete freedom. So,
the Soviets agree, and in September 1945, Grötrup moves to the Soviet zone and takes up his work at Rabe. Chertok would later note, "I would say that we were right on the money with Grötrup. Besides helping in technical matters, Grötrup helped in two more ways. One, by telling the Soviets about other skilled Germans who might be useful to the Soviets, and second, by directing the Russians to find more V2 equipment."
Also, by late 45, the Soviet reputation, at least in the scientific community, begins to improve. They treat most of the scientists well and provide food, clothing, and, in some cases, extravagant luxuries. Grötrup and his wife, for example, get a horse, a sports car, a mansion, and a sizable salary.
Oh, kann man machen.
Kann man machen.
But this is the exception, not the rule. For most in these post-war months, the main goal was not the prospect of getting a job and receiving a salary, but simply getting a guaranteed supply of food. Rarely anyone is motivated by ideological or political reasons.
They had enough of that. Combined with the fact that the Brits and Americans do not provide them with many attractive employment opportunities in their occupation zones, the appeal of the Soviet side increases significantly. So, by the end of 1945, over 1,200. I wanted to say that. Okay. So,
do it.
So, by the end of 45, over 1,200 skilled Germans begin working just for Rabe, pursuing Soviet rocketry aspirations.
They are further supplemented by others who do not have rocket experience per se, such as Professor Waldemar Wolf, the former chief ballistic expert for Krupp. Nevertheless, these men played crucial roles in helping the Soviets fill gaps in both understanding the operation of German missiles and setting up experiments to improve subsystems.
Besides Rabe and the Laboratory Construction Bureau, there are many other such cooperations in the Soviet zone, like the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt, German Aeronautical Testing Institute in Berlin Adlershof, the Torpedo Versuchsanstalt, Torpedo Testing Institute at Zwickau in Sachsen, the Technisches Spezialbüro der Gummiindustrie in Berlin-Weißensee, charged with applying rubber to various military purposes. The Ingenieurbüro SKG in Berlin Köpenick, working under a variety of rocket and radar tasks. The Büro für Nachrichtenwesen in Berlin-Ostkreuz concerned with telecommunication developments, and the SU works at Burgstedt in Sachsen, responsible, among other tasks, for developing a missile control apparatus. Thank you.
Gut gemacht.
So,
some of these only engage in research, while others also take up production. However, the Soviets do not plan to continue like that indefinitely. For one, what they are doing is technically illegal.
it is illegal.
It is very illegal. The Potsdam Agreement insisted that the production of arms, ammunition, and implements of war, as well as types of aircraft in sea-going ships, shall be prohibited and prevented in Germany.
So, by April 1946, this becomes even more clear as the Allied Control Council adopted Law Number 25, which prohibited applied scientific research in the areas of most concern and permitted it in other areas only under license. The law also prohibited fundamental research of the wholly or primarily military nature and forbade the Germans to possess certain kinds of apparatus.
It is essential to mention that the Soviets do not care about these resolutions and knowingly break them within their zone. Also, all German scientists working in any of these programs have shadows. Besides the Soviet higher-ups at the institute, such as Chertok, most German scientists and technicians have someone from the Soviet Union with relevant expertise peering over their shoulders at all times, learning everything they can about production techniques, blueprints, materials, and the like.
For example, at Rabe, more than 1,000 such shadows diligently compile everything worth knowing. Why? Well, the answer is quite simple: to move everything to the Soviet Union. Towards the same end, countless materials have already been sent there. The entire Mittelwerk is dismantled by 1,800 German workers, packaged and shipped east.
By February 1946, Soviet and German workers combined had expended about 80,000 person-hours of labor on the disassembly of rocket facilities. From Mittelwerk, they had loaded 717 wagons to carry 5,647 tons of equipment back to the Soviet Union. Roughly 6 months later, in September, the last major shift in the research structures in Germany occurs. Rabe and the facilities in Peenemünde and Berlin are combined to form the Nordhausen Institute.
Likewise, the joint central factory is founded. Production and testing are centralized and streamlined, with Gottrup at the helm. Towards the end of November, they have re-engineered 40 V2s and even conducted some testing. So, when do we finally get to Osoaviachim?
Now we do. Was?
Great. Go on.
Danke. In May 46, the fate of the facilities and the engineers was already sealed. On May 13, Stalin himself signed a top-level government decree establishing a skeletal network of research, development, and production facilities in and around Moscow to support work on ballistic missiles. Stalin's decree gave the missile a priority second only to that of the atomic bomb project as one of the most important government tasks. This decree gave birth to Operation Osoaviachim, and the Special Committee on Jet Technology under the Council of Ministers of the USSR. Among their tasks was relocating the German specialist and research bureau to Soviet Union.
The operation gets its name from a Soviet socio-political volunteer organization during the interwar years. It prepared reserve defense forces focusing on aviation and chemical defense. The name is an acronym for Society for the Assistance of Defense Aircraft and Chemical Construction.
The man in charge of relocations is Ivan Serov, one of the leading officers in the NKVD. During World War II, he was responsible for various mass deportations. He would also later become the head of the KGB.
In early October, he arrives at the Institute Nordhausen for a secret meeting with all the leading Soviet directors. He asks them to make a list with brief description of those German specialists who, in their opinion, might be of use working in the Soviet Union.
He explains that while the Americans have designated the scientists they've taken as prisoners of war, the Soviets would not do such a thing. They would give them proper housing and allow them to take their families and even furniture with them.
However, these preparations are by no means limited to rocketry experts in Nordhausen. Similar ones are made all across the Soviet zone. Veiled in secrecy, the Germans have no clue what awaits them next.
A banquet with Russian vodka, of course. Nostrovia. On the evening of October 2nd, in the Japan restaurant, the Soviets host a celebration for the German scientists near Nordhausen.
Just a quick side note, similar events occur all across the Soviet occupation zone.
Officially, it is because of the successful cooperation between Soviet and German experts and the results of the research programs. To mark the occasion, large amounts of Russian vodka are poured out for the guests. A keen-eyed observer may notice something peculiar. Namely, that no Soviets present at the party are drinking. They are under strict no drinking orders.
But after 4 or 5 shots of Russian white gold, this may be something that escapes one's attention. In any case, the party rages on into the early morning hours until when the sober Soviets send their German colleagues to bed. This too was a part of Zerov's plan. To make the Germans good and drunk, it will be easier to endure the trauma.
Okay, cool. As the drunken and dazed Germans stumble home to rest, they have no idea they'll only get an hour of sleep. At 3 a.m. across northeastern Germany, the trap closes shut and trucks pull up in front of the selected homes. The German scientists find Soviet soldiers, an interpreter, and a counterintelligence officer entering their houses. Everywhere, the same order is read.
According to the arrangement of the Soviet military administration in Germany, the organization where you have worked so far is being transferred to the Soviet Union. Along with the organization, you are likewise mobilized for work in the Soviet Union. Their families and possessions are taken along with them. The Soviets have prepared all this in great detail, with 92 freight trains made available for the transport of German cargo, according to the MVD records.
At this point, the NKVD had been dissolved and replaced by the MVD, Ministry of Internal Affairs.
90% of the German resists. However, if you have a dozen or so Russian men with guns in your houses, the resistance is left at words and declaration of protest. Throughout the following day, the 22nd, the chosen make their way to the Soviet Union primarily by train. All in all, 2,552 German specialists and 4,008 family members are recruited in that fashion. They end up at different ministries responsible for different research areas.
Specialists in aircraft or aero engine construction made up the largest group of deportees, with 1,385 individuals, with only 302 specialists being designated for the Soviet rocket program.
After 2 weeks, the Odyssey has finished, with the Germans spread over 31 different institutes across the European part of the Soviet Union.
According to one estimate, roughly 84% of the scientists recruited by the Soviets after the war were picked up in this one swoop. If you add the 100 or so nuclear scientists from 1945, you're left with pretty much everyone. While some stragglers do arrive later in 1947 and 1948, the deed is done, and the Soviets have the experts, technical know-how, and machinery to continue research and production on Soviet soil.
As for the fate of the German scientists, while not literally imprisoned, they are under guard and closely watched. Interaction with locals is to be kept at a minimum. Eventually, they are released and repatriated to the GDR. The first return with their families in 1950, with some only coming home almost 10 years after their abduction in 1955.
Overall, Osoaviachim and the previous efforts enabled the Soviet Union to catch up with the West using German machinery and expertise, allowing the Soviets to exceed US technical capabilities at times. Without these German scientists, production facilities, blueprints, and acquired know-how, the competition between the two superpowers in the 50s and 60s would likely have been significantly more one-sided.
If you'd like to know more about espionage, operations, and the competition for technology, check out some of our Spies and Ties videos, like our Paperclip special on similar American efforts or the Allied hunt for Nazi superweapons. To get ever more content like this, please join the Timegast Army at timegast.tv or patreon.com. And we will see you next time, darlings.